There is a place in Manhattan where one of the greatest and most tormented families in American history once lived behind walls of French limestone and rose marble. A place where the weight of a dynasty was held together by silk curtains and crystal chandeliers. Where a woman ruled an empire that had nothing to do with industry or war, and everything to do with who was allowed into a room and who was not. A place where tragedy struck again and again, where love crumbled, where fortune turned to dust, and where a mansion so vast and so legendary was eventually torn down and erased from the earth as though it had never existed at all. That place was 840 and 841, Fifth Avenue, Manhattan, New York. And this is the real story of the Astor family estate. And before we go any further into this story, I want to take just a moment to say thank you. If you are new here, welcome to the Dark Estate. This channel is where we uncover the true, verified histories behind the grandest, darkest, and most forgotten estates in the world. If this is your first time, please hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, drop a comment down below telling us what you think, and if you can, support the channel so we can keep bringing you stories like this one. Now, let us go back. Let us go back to the very beginning of the Astor name. Because to understand why that mansion on 65th Street mattered so deeply, you have to understand where the money came from in the first place. The year was 1763. In the small German town of Waldorf, near Heidelberg, a boy was born into a family so poor they could barely feed themselves. His name was John Jacob Astor, and his father was a butcher. There was nothing about this boy, nothing in the dust of that small European town, that suggested he would one day become the richest man in the United States. But that is exactly what happened. At 17, young Astor left Germany for London, where he worked with his older brother in a musical instrument business. He learned English. He learned how the world worked. And then, in 1783, just as the American Revolutionary War was drawing to its close, he boarded a ship for the New World. He arrived in Baltimore with almost nothing, a handful of flutes and a pocket barely worth counting. But on that long crossing of the Atlantic, he had met a fur trader. That single chance conversation would change everything. Within a few years of arriving in New York, Astor had opened his own fur goods shop. He bought raw hides from Native Americans and resold them in London and elsewhere at staggering profits. He was shrewd beyond measure. He was ruthless in business. And he understood something that very few men of his time grasped: that New York City, this young, sprawling, chaotic place, was going to become one of the greatest cities on earth. And so he began to buy land. Quietly, systematically, he purchased enormous tracts of Manhattan real estate, much of it in the sparsely populated northern reaches of the island that most people considered worthless farmland. Astor saw what others could not. He saw the future. By 1800, he had already amassed $250,000 and had become the leading figure in the American fur trade. In 1808, he founded the American Fur Company, which became, in effect, the first great business monopoly in United States history. His empire stretched from the Great Lakes to the Pacific coast. He established Fort Astoria in present-day Oregon, the first permanent American settlement on the Pacific shore. Presidents corresponded with him. Senators spoke his name with a mixture of envy and fear. A New York senator of the era, Nathaniel Talmadge, once remarked during a political campaign that $1 in every $100 in the country ended up in Astor's hands. That was not hyperbole. That was the reality of the man. But the fur trade, like all trades built on a single commodity, was not eternal. European fashions shifted. Beaver pelts fell out of favor. And John Jacob Astor, being the businessman he was, saw the decline coming long before it arrived. By the 1830s, he had quietly begun pulling his capital out of the fur business and pouring it into something far more permanent: New York City real estate. He bought land along the waterfront. He bought land in Lower Manhattan. He bought land in what would one day become some of the most valuable real estate on Earth. And when he died on March 29, 1848, at the age of 84, he was, without question, the wealthiest person in the United States. His estate was estimated at somewhere between $20 and $30 million, a sum that, when measured against the size of the American economy at the time, made him one of the richest individuals in all of recorded history. He left the bulk of that fortune to his son, William Backhouse Astor, and with that bequest, the Astor dynasty truly began. William Backhouse Astor Sr. took his father's real estate empire and expanded it enormously. He built over 700 stores and dwellings across New York City. He was called, by the press and by the public alike, the landlord of New York. By 1890, one expert calculated that the Astor family owned 1/20th of all real estate in New York City. 1/20th. The number is almost impossible to comprehend. And it was William's son, William Backhouse Astor Jr., who married a woman who would become one of the most powerful and most scrutinized figures in American social history. Her name was Caroline Webster Schermerhorn, and the world would come to know her simply as Mrs. Astor. Caroline Schermerhorn was born on September 22, 1830, into New York's Dutch aristocracy, descendants of the city's original colonial settlers. Her father, Abraham Schermerhorn, was worth $500,000 at the time of her birth and was deeply embedded in the shipping business. Caroline was educated in the manner befitting a girl of her station. She spoke fluent French. She learned the precise codes of etiquette that govern the lives of New York's old money elite. And on September 23, 1853, she married William Backhouse Astor Jr. It was, by all accounts, a marriage of social convenience. William spent most of his time away from the family, on his yacht, at the family's country estate called Ferncliff in Rhinebeck, New York, or tending to business dealings in Florida. Caroline, for her part, was left to manage the household, and, increasingly, to manage something far larger than any household. She was left to manage New York society itself. In 1862, Caroline and William built a 4-bay brownstone townhouse at 350 Fifth Avenue, on what is now the site of the Empire State Building. It was a surprisingly modest structure for a family of their wealth, but appearances were deceiving. Behind those respectable brownstone walls, Caroline had constructed something extraordinary. She had built in the back of the house a grand ballroom, an entertainment space that could hold approximately 400 people. And that ballroom was about to become the most consequential room in the social life of the United States. The decades following the Civil War were a period of violent transformation in American society. New York City's population was exploding. Immigrants were arriving by the hundreds of thousands. And a new class of staggeringly wealthy industrialists, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, were emerging with fortunes made not from old family land, but from railroads, steel, oil, and finance. These were men and women with enormous power, but they lacked one thing that Caroline Astor and her circle possessed, and that was social legitimacy. They were, in the language of the era, arrivistas, newcomers. And Caroline was determined to keep them in their place. Together with her close friend and social advisor Ward McAllister, Caroline embarked on a project that sounds almost absurd to modern ears, but which carried extraordinary weight at the time. They set out to define, once and for all, who belonged in New York high society and who did not. McAllister, a Southern-born lawyer who had reinvented himself as the interpreter of elite social customs, declared publicly that there were, in his estimation, only 400 people in all of New York who truly mattered. The people who felt at ease in a ballroom and who could move through society with grace and authority. The number 400 became legendary. It has been popularly linked to the capacity of Caroline Astor's ballroom, though the exact origins of the number remain a matter of some historical debate. What is not debatable is the power that number carried. To be among the 400 was to have your place in the social order confirmed. To be excluded was to be, in a very real sense, invisible to the people who controlled the cultural life of the nation. Caroline held her social season from November through February each year. Her annual ball was the single most important social event in New York. Invitations were issued on the basis of calling cards, small, printed rectangles that served as the currency of social acceptance. Caroline's calling card bore only 2 words: Mrs. Astor. Not Caroline. Not Mrs. William B. Astor. Just Mrs. Astor. As though she were the only one in the world. And in the rarefied air of Gilded Age New York, for a time, she very nearly was. Her parties were affairs of extraordinary opulence. The ballroom's silk-lined walls were hung with paintings from Caroline's art collection. Persian rugs covered the parquet floors. Crystal chandeliers cast their cold, brilliant light across the room. Caroline herself would dress in gowns by the great Parisian couturier Charles Frederick Worth, adorned with her famous diamond tiara and necklace. She would descend the grand staircase before her guests, and she would take her position on her velvet divan, always in her preferred color, royal purple, and she would receive the assembled elite of New York as though she were a monarch holding court. And in many ways she was. But even as Caroline held sway over the drawing rooms of Manhattan, a bitter and deeply personal feud was festering within her own family. The source of the conflict was deceptively simple. It was a question of a title. After Caroline's husband died in 1892, she continued to style herself as the Mrs. Astor on her calling card. But her nephew, William Waldorf Astor, the son of her husband's elder brother, John Jacob Astor III, believed that his own wife should hold that title, since William Waldorf was, technically, the male head of the senior branch of the Astor family. Caroline refused to budge. She would not add her first name or her husband's name to the card. She would not share the title with anyone. And William Waldorf, humiliated by his aunt's intransigence, decided to exact a revenge that would reshape the landscape of Manhattan. In 1890, William Waldorf Astor ordered the demolition of his own childhood mansion, the house his father had built on the northwest corner of 5th Avenue and 33rd Street, right next door to Caroline's brownstone. On that cleared lot, he built the Waldorf Hotel, a 13-story structure in the German Renaissance style that towered over Caroline's comparatively modest home like a wall of commercial indifference. The noise of the construction alone was brutal. And when the hotel opened its doors on March 13, 1893, the streams of visitors, the constant activity, the sheer presence of a massive public establishment next door to what had been one of the most private and exclusive addresses in New York. It was, as William Waldorf intended, a kind of social warfare. Caroline reportedly remarked, with characteristic disdain, that there was now a glorified tavern next door. But the damage was done. Her neighborhood had been invaded. And William Waldorf, having made his point, moved to England, where he would eventually become a British citizen and be elevated to the title of Viscount Astor. Caroline did not stay on 34th Street for long after that. The world was moving north along 5th Avenue, and she knew it. Her son, John Jacob Astor IV, known to intimates and to the press as Jack, persuaded his mother to leave the old brownstone and to build something new, something grander, something that would make a statement of its own. And so, in 1894, construction began on what would become one of the largest and most magnificent mansions ever built on 5th Avenue. The address was 840 and 841, 5th Avenue, on the northeast corner of 65th Street, facing Central Park. The architect was Richard Morris Hunt. To appreciate what Hunt's name meant at that moment in American history, you have to understand who he was. Born in 1827 in Vermont, Hunt became the first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the most prestigious architecture school in the world. He returned to the United States carrying with him the aesthetic vocabulary of French Renaissance design, and he spent the next 4 decades reshaping the visual identity of the American elite. He designed the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. He designed the entrance facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He designed the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, still the largest private home in the United States. He designed the great Newport mansions for the Vanderbilt family, including the Breakers and Marble House. Hunt was, by any measure, the Dean of American Architecture, the man who gilded the Gilded Age, and when Caroline Astor and her son commissioned him to design their new home, they were hiring the single most important architect in the country. Hunt conceived the mansion as a double residence, 2 homes joined seamlessly under one roof. From the outside, the structure presented itself as a single, unified French Renaissance chateau, modeled after the great chateaux of the Loire Valley in France, specifically drawing inspiration from the Chateau de Blois during the periods of Louis XII and François I. The facade was clad in French limestone. The roofline was punctuated by dormers, balustrades, and the kind of elaborate stonework that whispered of centuries of European aristocratic tradition. It was, by every account, one of the most beautiful buildings ever constructed on Fifth Avenue. But behind that unified facade, the interior was divided. Caroline occupied the northern half, at number 841. Jack and his family lived in the southern half, at number 840. The 2 sides were connected by a domed glass vestibule, a kind of shared entrance hall that also functioned as a gallery. But otherwise, each family had their own staircases, their own bedrooms, their own private spaces. The interior of the mansion was a catalogue of excess that would take hours to describe in full. The principal entrance led through the domed vestibule into a hall lined with busts of Astor ancestors, a deliberate display of genealogical authority, a visual reminder to anyone who entered that this family had been accumulating wealth and influence for generations. From the entrance hall, visitors moved through a series of receiving rooms, each decorated with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that only enormous wealth could sustain. There were Persian rugs in deep reds and burgundies. There were satin-paneled walls. There were oriental vases filled with fresh flowers. There was a breakfast room containing Caroline's prized teacup collection, a collection she had assembled over decades with the same precision she brought to assembling her guest lists. And then there was the ballroom. The ballroom at 840 Fifth Avenue was the largest room in the house, spanning the entire rear of the mansion, and rising 4 stories from floor to ceiling. It doubled as an art gallery. The walls were hung with Caroline's famed collection of paintings, while the marble herringbone floors were covered with 4 massive oriental rugs and 16 long, narrow Persian rugs, all in shades of red. Peacock feathered woven rugs were scattered across the floor in patterns that caught the light. From the ceiling hung 4 enormous crystal chandeliers, each connected to the others by strings of pearls. At one end of the room stood a massive marble chimneypiece that rose to the ceiling, decorated with 2 sculptures of male caryatids, supporting a painted panel depicting a gala at the Palace of Versailles. The ballroom could hold 1,200 people, 3 times the capacity of Caroline's old ballroom on 34th Street. It was, without exaggeration, one of the most spectacular private entertaining spaces ever built in the United States. Caroline moved into the new mansion around 1896, and for a time, the house on 65th Street became the new center of her social empire. She hosted her balls there. She received her guests there. The 400 came to her doors, presented their cards, and were admitted into the glittering world she had constructed. Meanwhile, back on 34th Street, Caroline's old brownstone was demolished. And on that site, her son Jack built the Astoria Hotel, which joined with his cousin William Waldorf's Waldorf Hotel to create the legendary Waldorf Astoria. For a time, the largest hotel in the world, with 1,300 rooms, connected by the famous 300-meter corridor known as Peacock Alley. The irony was not lost on anyone. The family feud that had driven Caroline from her home had, in the end, produced one of the most celebrated hotels in history. But Caroline Astor was aging, and the world she had spent decades constructing was beginning to crack at the edges, not just because of her own declining health, but because of grief that had been accumulating like sediment at the bottom of a life spent mostly in public performance. Her husband, William Backhouse Astor Jr., died of an aneurysm in Paris in 1892. By all accounts, Caroline mourned him more out of social propriety than personal devastation. William had spent most of their marriage elsewhere, on his yacht at country estates, conducting business far from the social machinery his wife had built. Their marriage had been a transaction, and it had run its course. Caroline observed the customary period of mourning, and then, as one historian noted, she went about resuming her social activities with a kind of efficiency that suggested she had been preparing for widowhood for some time. But the next blow was harder to absorb. In 1893, just a year after her husband's death, Caroline's 34-year-old daughter Helen died. Helen had married James Roosevelt, the elder half-brother of the man who would one day become President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. She died of an overdose of laudanum, a form of opium that was widely used as a painkiller and sedative in that era. The cause was not publicly discussed in detail, as such things were handled with discretion among families of Caroline's standing. But the grief was real, and it struck Caroline at a moment when she was already vulnerable. According to historian John D. Gates, who wrote extensively about the Astor family, Caroline's active influence over New York society peaked in 1891. After that, the world began to move on without her. The rigid traditions she had maintained, the calling cards, the formal seasons, the elaborate codes of etiquette that governed who could speak to whom, and in what order, were increasingly seen as outdated by a younger generation of society figures who wanted something more dynamic, more spontaneous, more alive. Caroline found, as Gates wrote, that the new faces in society did not accept the credentials of her older circle. The ground was shifting beneath her feet, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her last great party, the final ball she hosted at the mansion on 65th Street, took place in 1905. After that, she began to withdraw from public life. And as she withdrew, the dementia set in. What happened to Caroline Astor in her final years is documented by multiple sources, including her biographer Greg King. And it is one of the saddest passages in the story of this family. As her mind began to deteriorate, Caroline's grasp on reality loosened by degrees. In the mornings, she would receive her butler and discuss in detail the arrangements for dinners that would never take place. She would go over guest lists for balls that had no date, no occasion, no guests coming to attend. She was planning events in a vacuum, performing the rituals of her former life for an audience that existed only in her fading memory. In the evenings after her customary carriage ride through Central Park, a ritual she had maintained for decades, she would return to the mansion and sit in her silent, empty rooms, receiving no one. At one point, according to accounts of her final years, her dementia progressed to the point where she believed she was pregnant and began preparing a nursery. It was a delusion born, perhaps, from some deep fold in her memory, some echo of the younger woman she had once been, when the house was full of children and the future still stretched out before her. Caroline was confined to her bed in her final months, suffering from heart palpitations. Her son Jack and his wife were by her bedside as she declined. But it was only her youngest daughter, Caroline, known as Carrie, who was with her in her final hour. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor died on October 30th, 1908, at the mansion on 65th Street. She was 78 years old. She was interred at Trinity Church Cemetery in Upper Manhattan. In 1914, her daughter Carrie commissioned a memorial cross for her mother in the churchyard, a monument that stands to this day. After her death, it took 3 women to fill the social vacuum she had left behind. They were Alva Belmont, Mamie Fish, and Teresa Fair Ulrichs, known collectively as the Triumvirate of American society. No single person could do what Caroline had done. The age of the single social arbiter, the one woman whose approval could make or break a family's standing, was over. Her era was finished. And now the mansion belonged entirely to her son Jack. John Jacob Astor IV was, by 1908, one of the most prominent and most complicated men in New York. He was born on July 13, 1864, at the family's country estate of Ferncliff in Rhinebeck, New York, the youngest of 5 children and the only son of William Backhouse Astor Jr. and Caroline. He attended the prestigious St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, and then Harvard University. And he was a businessman of genuine ability, not merely a passive heir coasting on inherited wealth, but an active developer and investor who left his own marks on the city his family had shaped for generations. In 1897, Jack built the Astoria Hotel, described at the time as the world's most luxurious hotel, which adjoined his cousin William Waldorf's Waldorf Hotel, and together became the legendary Waldorf Astoria. In 1904, he opened the St. Regis Hotel, which the New York Times called the finest hotel in America at the time. Jack ensured that every room in the St. Regis had its own telephone, a technological luxury still unusual in hotels of that era. Some historians have called the St. Regis his greatest single achievement. He was also credited with inventing an early form of air conditioning, a system that blew cold air over the hotel's wall vents. He held patents for other inventions as well. He was a writer who had published a speculative novel called A Journey in Other Worlds, which imagined what life might look like in the year 2000, a work that raced, as one contemporary noted, far ahead of the 19th century in its imaginative scope. He had served as a lieutenant colonel during the Spanish-American War in 1898. Shortly after the outbreak of the conflict, Jack personally financed a volunteer artillery unit known as the Astor Battery, which served in the Philippines. He was appointed a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Volunteers and served as an officer on the staff of Major General William Shafter in Cuba during the Santiago campaign. From 1894 to 1896, he had also served as a colonel on the military staff of New York Governor Levi P. Morton. He was, in short, not merely a trust fund heir. He was an active, ambitious, and genuinely industrious man, one of the most recognizable figures in the country. And he was, by the time his mother died, one of the wealthiest men in the world, with a personal fortune estimated at somewhere between $80 and $90 million, a sum that, adjusted for inflation, would be measured in the billions today. After Caroline's death, Jack hired the architectural firm of Carrere and Hastings to renovate the double mansion into a single residence. The 2 grand staircases were removed and replaced with one large entrance hall, with smaller staircases on either side. The rooms that had been his mother's were redone. The entire structure was unified into one of the largest private homes in New York City. And in February of 1911, Jack held a housewarming party for 208 guests to unveil the newly transformed mansion to New York society. It was meant to be a celebration, a declaration that the Astor name was still at the center of everything that mattered in this city. But Jack's personal life was in turmoil. His first marriage, to Ava Lowell Willing, had been celebrated in 1891. The couple had 2 children, a son named William Vincent, born in 1891, and a daughter named Ava Alice, born in 1902. But the marriage had been deeply unhappy for years. Ava was described by contemporaries as beautiful but cold, glacially so. The relationship deteriorated over time, and in 1909, Jack and Ava divorced. Divorce was scandalous in that era, and the situation was made worse by the fact that Ava was reportedly unkind, enough to publicize that she had married Jack primarily for his money. The press had a field day. And then, just months after the divorce was finalized, Jack married again. His second wife was an 18-year-old socialite named Madeline Talmadge Force, the sister of real estate businesswoman and socialite Catherine Emmons Force. Their parents were William Hurlbut Force and Catherine Arvilla Talmadge. Jack was 47. Madeline was 18. Their age difference was 29 years. Madeline was, in fact, 2 years younger than Jack's own son Vincent. The scandal was immediate and ferocious. New York society, which Jack had spent his life cultivating, turned on him almost overnight. Invitations dried up. Doors closed. The press called him every name it could think of. Vincent, by his own account, despised his stepmother. And yet, in a gesture that speaks to the complicated loyalties of family, Vincent served as best man at his father's wedding. The ceremony took place on September 9, 1911, in the ballroom at Beechwood, the Astor family's summer mansion in Newport, Rhode Island. Among the few prominent Americans who did not shun Jack during this period was Margaret Brown, the woman who would later be fictionalized, in the popular imagination, and eventually on Broadway and film, as the unsinkable Molly Brown. Brown accompanied the Astors on their travels through Europe and Egypt, and it was during this time that the friendship between them deepened. To escape the gossip, Jack and Madeline embarked on an extended honeymoon through Europe and Egypt. They traveled widely. They enjoyed the freedom of being far from the judgmental eyes of New York. And then Madeline became pregnant. Wanting the child to be born on American soil, Jack booked passage home for April of 1912. He chose the most luxurious ship available, a brand new vessel on its maiden voyage, one that was being called, by the press and by its builders, unsinkable. The ship was the RMS Titanic. Jack and Madeline boarded the Titanic at Cherbourg, France, on April 10, 1912. They were the wealthiest passengers aboard. They traveled in first class, accompanied by Jack's valet, Victor Robbins, Madeline's maid, Rosalie Bidois, her nurse, Caroline Louise Endres, and their Airedale terrier named Kitty. The Astors had been deeply fond of their dog, and had come close to losing her on a previous trip when she went missing in Egypt. Kitty did not survive the sinking. They knew some of the other passengers, among them Margaret Brown, whom they had traveled with earlier that year. According to one eyewitness account, Jack pointed out some of the vital statistics of the ship to fellow passengers, and remarked that she was unsinkable, a modern shipbuilding miracle. The voyage had barely begun when, on the night of April 14th, the Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. What happened next has been recounted countless times, but it bears telling again, because the details matter, and because they reveal something important about the man Jack Astor was in the final hours of his life. When the collision occurred, Jack reportedly approached Captain Edward Smith, a captain so well liked by wealthy passengers that he was known in first class as the millionaire's captain, and asked him about the severity of the situation, mentioning that his wife was not feeling well and had gone to bed. The captain advised him to wake her. Jack did so calmly. He told Madeline the damage did not appear serious. For a time, the passengers, including the Astors, talked about the collision almost casually. Jack and Madeline even played with the mechanical horses in the ship's gymnasium as the situation aboard grew more desperate. As the lifeboats began to be loaded, Jack led his pregnant wife to the deck. He helped her dress warmly. He adorned her with her jewelry. He put her into one of the last lifeboats, the second to last by some accounts. According to multiple eyewitness accounts, Jack asked an officer if he could accompany his wife, given her delicate condition. He was told he would have to wait until all women and children were away. Jack accepted this without argument. He reportedly gave Madeline his gloves, lit a cigarette, and stepped back from the lifeboat. His wife was reluctant to leave his side, but Jack assured her that she would be safe and that they would reunite in the morning. He was last seen on the deck of the Titanic, smoking, as the ship began to sink beneath the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. Some accounts place him in the company of the author Jacques Futrelle, who also perished that night. Madeline survived. Their unborn child survived, a boy, born in August of 1912, named John Jacob Astor VI. But Jack did not survive. His body was recovered by the cable ship Mackay Bennett on April 22. It was identified by the initials sewn into the back of his jacket and by his gold Waltham pocket watch, engraved with the letters JJA. Among his other recovered possessions were a diamond ring, gold and diamond cufflinks, £225 in English banknotes, and $2,440 in American currency. His son Vincent traveled to Halifax to claim his father's body and bring it home. Jack was buried at Trinity Cemetery in New York City. The Titanic sank on April 15, 1912, and with it went the richest man aboard. A man worth, by modern calculations, somewhere in the range of $2 to $3 billion. The inquiries that followed were held, with a cruel irony, at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, the very hotel that had been born from the feud within Jack's own family. John Jacob Astor IV was gone. And with him, something essential had departed from the mansion on 65th Street. Jack's estate was vast. His will had been written before the Titanic voyage, and in it he had planned to make the unborn child with Madeline, the child who would become John Jacob Astor VI, his primary heir. But the law did not work that way. The child had not yet been born when Jack died. And so, as was customary, the estate passed to his eldest son from his first marriage, a young man named Vincent Astor, who had been born William Vincent Astor in 1891. Vincent was just 20 years old and an undergraduate at Harvard when his world was shattered. He had been close to his father. Jack had doted on him by all accounts, and the sudden responsibility of managing what Vincent inherited weighed heavily on a young man who had spent his life in the shadow of his father's larger presence. His inheritance was staggering: $69 million in cash, equivalent to roughly $2 billion in modern terms, the St. Regis Hotel, and vast tracts of New York City real estate. Practically overnight, Vincent became one of the wealthiest young men alive. He was also, in the eyes of the press and the public, the boy whose father had gone down with the Titanic. Among the possessions recovered from Jack's body after the sinking was a gold pocket watch, a 14-karat gold Waltham timepiece, engraved with the initials JJA. Vincent kept that watch for the rest of his life. He carried it with him, a daily reminder of the night his world changed, of the morning when the cable ship Mackay Bennett pulled his father's body from the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. It was not a talisman of good fortune. It was a wound that never fully closed. Jack's second wife, Madeline, retained ownership of the mansion on 65th Street after his death. She lived there for a time, raising her infant son. But when she remarried in 1916, wedding a man named William K. Dick, she relinquished her claim on the property by the terms of Jack's will, and it passed to Vincent and his wife, Helen Huntington Astor. Vincent and Helen entertained at the mansion for a time. They hosted dinners for social and philanthropic causes. But increasingly, Vincent favored his estates in the Hudson Valley and on Long Island over the massive, high-maintenance urban mansion on Fifth Avenue. The costs of keeping such a place were staggering. The staff alone required to maintain a house of that size was enormous, and the taxes on Fifth Avenue real estate were climbing year by year as the city grew and changed around it. There was something else, too, something quieter and harder to name. The mansion on 65th Street had been built for Caroline. It had been her stage, her theater, her instrument of social power. After Caroline died, Jack had renovated it, unified it, made it his own. But Jack was gone too. And Vincent, for all his wealth, was not the kind of man who craved the spotlight the way his grandmother had. He was quieter, more introspective, more troubled. The house was too large for the life he wanted to live, and perhaps too haunted by the lives that had been lived in it before him. By 1924, the contents of the mansion had begun to be auctioned off, and in May of 1925, Vincent Astor sold the mansion itself. The buyer was a real estate developer named Benjamin Winter Sr. The price was approximately $3 million, a fraction of what the property and its contents had cost to build and furnish, but a substantial sum nonetheless for a piece of land in an era when real estate values were shifting rapidly. Before the sale was completed, Vincent made one last gesture toward his father's memory. He had Jack's bedroom, the room where his father had slept, the most personal space in the house, carefully dismantled. The architectural elements, the furnishings, the details that made the room what it was, were removed and reinstalled in Vincent's own, much smaller townhouse at 130 East 80th Street. It was a tribute, a way of keeping something of Jack alive in a world that had moved on without him. The rest of the mansion, the ballroom, the receiving rooms, the domed vestibule, the grand staircase, the Persian rugs and the crystal chandeliers and the marble chimneypieces, all of it was dispersed. In 1926, the American Art Association held a public auction of the mansion's remaining contents. Paintings, furniture, architectural elements, decorative ceilings. All of it was sold off piece by piece. People came from across the city to see what remained of one of the grandest houses ever built in New York. And then the demolition crews moved in. The mansion that Richard Morris Hunt had designed, one of the largest and most beautiful private homes ever constructed on Fifth Avenue, a house that had once held the beating heart of American high society, was torn down. Stone by stone, beam by beam, it was reduced to rubble and carted away. Children, according to one photograph from the period, were seen playing in the ruins, standing in the bathtub that had been left behind in the wreckage, a porcelain fixture that had once belonged to one of the wealthiest families in American history, now sitting exposed to the open sky on a cleared lot on Fifth Avenue. It is an image that captures, in a single frame, the way wealth and grandeur dissolve when no one is left to maintain them. Richard Morris Hunt, the architect who had conceived this masterpiece of French Renaissance design, had already been dead for over 30 years by the time the demolition crews arrived. Hunt passed away on July 31, 1895, in Newport, Rhode Island, before the mansion he designed for the Astors was even completed. A memorial was built for him in Central Park along Fifth Avenue, near 70th Street, just a handful of blocks from where his last Great Commission once stood. The memorial, designed by architect Bruce Price with sculptures by Daniel Chester French, features a bust of Hunt flanked by two caryatids, one representing art, the other architecture. It stands to this day as a tribute to the man who, more than any other single architect, set the visual tone of the Gilded Age. But the house itself, the house that was supposed to be his crowning achievement on Fifth Avenue, was gone. In 1925, the Congregation of Temple Emmanuel, New York's first Reformed Jewish congregation, and one of the largest synagogues in the world, had purchased the property. Construction on the new temple began in 1927. It was designed by architects Robert D. Cohn, Charles Butler, and Clarence Stein in a Romanesque revival style with Byzantine influences. On January 10, 1930, 2,500 people attended the formal dedication of Temple Emmanuel at 1 East 65th Street. The synagogue still stands there today. There is a profound irony in this. Caroline Astor had spent decades constructing an elaborate system of social exclusion, a world in which only certain families, certain bloodlines, certain names were permitted entry. The Jewish community of New York, no matter how wealthy or prominent its members had become, was largely shut out of that world. The old money Christian-oriented Knickerbocker establishment that Caroline had presided over drew its lines clearly, and Jews, for the most part, were on the other side of them. And now, where the Astor Mansion had stood, where the 400 had danced and Caroline had held court on her purple velvet divan, a synagogue rose. New York's Jewish community had arrived. They had built their temple on the very ground where exclusion had once reigned. The mansion is gone. It has been gone for nearly a century. But the story of the Astor family did not end with the demolition of the house on 65th Street. Vincent Astor lived on for decades after selling the mansion, and the man he became in those years stands in sharp contrast to the cold, calculating dynasty that had come before him. Vincent had inherited not only the Astor fortune, but also the Astor reputation. And that reputation, for much of the family's history, had been a troublesome one. The original John Jacob Astor had been criticized for decades after his death for the way he managed his real estate holdings, particularly his treatment of tenants in some of New York's poorest neighborhoods. The Astor name had become, in the popular imagination, synonymous with the greed and indifference of the very rich. Vincent was aware of this. He was acutely aware of it. And he spent much of his adult life trying to change it. He began reshaping neighborhoods in Manhattan. He converted rows of old brownstones into apartments for young professionals and artists. On the Lower East Side, he built affordable housing for working immigrant families, housing that included playgrounds, community spaces, and youth centers. These were not simply profitable ventures, though they were profitable. They were, it seems, a genuine effort to move away from the family's darker legacy. Vincent sold off many of the older Astor holdings, the ones associated with the family's reputation as landlords who extracted rent from the desperate, and reinvested in projects that served communities rather than simply exploiting them. In 1948, Vincent established the Vincent Astor Foundation, with the stated purpose of alleviating human misery. He poured significant portions of his fortune into educational institutions, healthcare initiatives, and civic causes across New York City. In 1953, he married Brooke Astor, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated philanthropists of her generation. Together, Vincent and Brooke became the public face of a transformed Astor legacy. No longer the cold landlords of old New York, but benefactors who gave back to the city that had made their family rich. Vincent Astor died of a heart attack on November 28, 1959, at the age of 67. There is a detail in his story that carries a weight almost too heavy to bear. Years before his final death, Vincent suffered his first heart attack. It happened as he was walking into a theater to see a film. The film was called A Night to Remember, a movie about the sinking of the Titanic. The film that told the story of the night his father died. Whether it was the stress of that evening, or the accumulated weight of a lifetime spent in the shadow of that tragedy, or simply the cruelty of coincidence, Vincent's heart seized in the lobby of that theater as the story of his father's death flickered on a screen inside. He survived that first attack, but the heart had been damaged. And in the end, it was that heart that killed him. At the time of Vincent's death, his fortune had grown to approximately $200 million. He left the bulk of it to Brooke and to his foundation. Brooke inherited $67 million, much of which she gave to charity. Over the following decades, through both Vincent's foundation and Brooke's tireless philanthropic work, billions of today's dollars were poured into New York institutions, libraries, zoos, literacy programs, parks, community centers. By the time Brooke Astor herself died, in 2007, the Astor fortune had been largely transformed into public good. So that is where we arrive at the end of this story. A German immigrant arrives in New York with almost nothing, and within decades builds the greatest fortune in America. His descendants build mansions that rival the palaces of Europe. They throw parties that define the social life of a nation. They feud with each other so bitterly that the feud produces one of the most famous hotels ever built. One of them boards a ship that sinks, taking him and his wealth and his promise to the bottom of the Atlantic. A young man inherits everything, carries the memory of his father's death like a wound that never fully heals, and spends the rest of his life trying to turn that inherited wealth into something that does more good than harm. And the mansion, the great, glittering, impossible mansion on 65th Street, is torn down. Gone. Replaced by a synagogue that stands as its own kind of testament to how the world moves on, and how the lines that people draw around themselves are, in the end, written in sand. The house at 840 and 841 Fifth Avenue no longer exists. Richard Morris Hunt, the architect who designed it, had already been dead for a year by the time construction was completed. He passed away in Newport, Rhode Island, on July 31, 1895. A memorial was built for him in Central Park along Fifth Avenue, near 70th Street, just blocks from where his last Great Commission once stood. Caroline Astor is gone. Jack is gone. Vincent is gone. Brooke is gone. The mansion is gone. And yet the story persists, carried in photographs, in auction catalogs, in the memories of a city that has never quite stopped talking about what once stood on that corner. Because that is what happens with places like this. They disappear from the physical world, but they do not disappear from history. They live on in the stories we tell about them. Stories about money and power and loneliness and loss, about the things we build to prove we existed, and about the way those things crumble, one way or another, long after we are gone. And that is the dark story of the Astor family estate. If you have made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. This is the dark estate, and this is the kind of story we live to tell. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button. Leave a comment down below. Tell us what surprised you, what moved you, or what you want to know more about. And if there is a historical mansion, an estate, a house with a story that deserves to be told, drop the name in the comments. We read every single one. Until next time, this is the Dark Estate. Stay curious. Stay haunted.